This is an interview with Jeremy Wailes for the Concord Historical Commission. It is part of the Veterans Oral History Project and is being held on September 27th, 2000 at Mr. Wailes' home. The interviewers are Laurie Belton and Sarah Wilbur, members of the Commission. Mr. Wailes was in the British Navy Air Force, yes? Yes, Fleet, I'll let him explain that, and is presently 69 years old. Would you tell us how you happened to go into the service?
At that time, in the 50s, in Britain, there was national service, which is the same as the draft, and everybody had to go into one service or the other for 2 years after the age of 18 or 19. I was 19 when I went in. I picked the Navy because the Navy had obligingly just started accepting people for commissions for national service at that time, but these were only for aircrew, pilots, and what have been called observers, which are navigators in the rest of the world. My father had been an observer in the Air Force, not the Air Force, the Fleet Air Arm, in its very, which is part of the Navy. He'd been a naval officer. He'd gone to the Naval College in the First World War. He left it's a different war. But he had been one of the very early flyers. There was a fairly tough selection process for aircrew in the Navy. Lots of people wanted to do it, and I was concerned that I wouldn't get in. And my father had said, "Don't worry about it." And I didn't quite understand until I went for my interviews and was greeted almost with a hug by the first senior officer I met, who said he hadn't seen me since I was 2 years old, but he'd kept in touch with me through our nanny who lived down the street from him. And the second one said I needed glasses, which eventually, but I'd been at school with his son, so that didn't matter. And the final interview was with a whole board headed by a captain who asked me if I collected stamps, and when I said no, I didn't, he was surprised. He said, "Your father had a very good collection, and do you still live in that house you had in Devonshire?" And I said, "No, we don't." He said, "That was a very nice house. I rented it from you one summer." So I wasn't really selected for the Navy. It was, I cheated. So I got into the Navy that way. But this was right at the start of the Korean War, and technically I was in for 2 years only. My flying training lasted 2 years, but since everybody basically was going on to Korea, I signed on for another 2 years, which meant putting off going to university, and so that I could go to Korea. And so I left for Korea by British Airways in early September 1952. And I arrived in Japan, spent a short time getting familiarized with the batsman, what in the United States Navy is the landing signals officer, who has to know each pilot and their idiosyncrasies. So one always practices ashore. Practiced with him for a short time at Iwakuni in Japan, and then joined the ship, arriving on board at 3 a.m. on my 21st birthday. That was... and we sailed the next morning for the coast of Korea. The system that we had then, we were working, there were two aircraft carriers off the west coast of Korea all the time. One British, one American. And we would do 9 days on the station, 4 days flying, 1 day replenishing, then 4 days flying. And then we would leave, go back to Japan, and the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier would take over from us. We only were there doubled up once, as I recall, when there was both ourselves and the Marine Checkerboard Squadron was aboard that, one of the better-known U.S. Marine squadrons. And we were flying in one part of Korea. Well, they were in sight. We could see them where they were. What do you need to know about? You need to know about the Korean War.
What was your experience? You were over in the Yellow Sea?
Yes, off the west coast. We were off what is the Haiju Peninsula. Here is Haiju.
Below Fujian, or were you further north?
We were just basically, here is the 38th parallel, but the 38th parallel, yeah, our job really was everything the other side of the 38th parallel, the line, because the line at that time was absolutely stagnant, just north of Seoul. We were supposed to be seeing that supplies weren't moved, railway lines were cut,
Nothing was coming south.
that we were supposed to see that nothing was coming south. But we only flew by day. We used to do some pre-dawn strikes, which meant we were over there when it was still absolutely dark. And the roads, the major roads, would be alight with trucks, dimmed lights, but you could see lines and lines of trucks coming. And our job, south, with supplies. No, just bringing down supplies to the, presumably to the front.
So you were flying over North Korea?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Well, yes.
Mm-hmm. You were flying
Certainly.
above the 38th parallel.
Well, we were flying beyond the line, although the line was stagnant there. Had it been earlier, we'd have been flying up by Pyongyang at the time that the line was up there. We did not go near Pyongyang. Pyongyang was heavily defended, and the commander-in-chief out there was an American admiral whom we admired and loved passionately, because he had announced that there was not a single target in North Korea worth the life of one of our pilots. And we all agreed.
Were you flying reconnaissance, or were you actually dropping bombs?
Bombs, yes. I was in what is called a strike fighter squadron, flying Fairey Fireflies. Fairey being the name of the builders, not Effete Fireflies. And the fighter squadron there were flying Furies, Sea Furies. And we had equal number of aircraft, and the two squadrons flew separately but together, basically. We did the Fireflies were slower, top speed around 180 knots, downhill with the wind 240. The Sea Furies were fighter aircraft, and flew considerably faster, therefore had greater range. But we all carried the same sort of armament. We either carried a bomb on each wing, which would either be a 500-pound bomb or a 1,000-pound bomb, or 8 rockets, 40-pound rocket heads, 60-pound rocket heads, which are high explosive. And we would be given targets every day that had been sent to us by the South Koreans. Had a lot of, I suppose you could say they were rather like the Marquis in France during the war. They were people behind the lines, operating quietly behind the lines and sending reports back as to where shipments of materials were being sent, and we'd be given map references and go and find them. Frankly, we felt our task was kind of fruitless because, as I said, we go up there early in the morning, at an hour and a half, 2 hours before the sunrise, because we could take off in the dark, but at that time none of us had done many night deck landings. We'd done a couple, but well, none of us flew at night. Yes, yeah, and night landings, and you couldn't see anything. There was no point in flying at night, really. We would go out to attack convoys on the roads because our mission was to see that absolutely nothing moved, but of course it was all moving all night anyway. And as the junior person on the flight of 4, we just got out there, I was always the fourth one down. The leader would start the dive down and drop the bombs or fire the rockets at this line of lights. As soon as he fired his rockets, every light in North Korea, as far as one could see, just clicked out like that. And so the number 4 person was left absolutely in the dark, diving down at either 40 or 60 degrees, depending upon what sort of dive we were doing, knowing that there were very steep hills there, and one would just fire at nothing at all and hope that it surprised somebody but didn't hurt anybody, and pull up quickly before one was in between all of these very jagged, very sharp mountains. The roads were in the valleys, yes, and but one could, if one, those hills were so steep. They're beautiful hills. The sunsets were incredible. And one morning when, I don't know why, I seemed to be by myself, and the sun rose. I was at about 8,000 feet, and the sun rose, a staggeringly beautiful sunrise. And I thought, that's absolutely beautiful. I'd like to see it again. So I dropped down 2,000 feet, and the sun rose again. And I said, that's wonderful, just one more time, and dropped down another 2,000 feet. This is serious war, you see. And then I decided I couldn't go on any lower than that. So I had to be content with 3 simply beautiful sunrises all in one morning.
You were the pilot.
I was the pilot. No. We carried 1 navigator for each section of 4. We call them observers in the Navy. But there was only 1. We sort of also knew where we were. It was not a large area, and after one had been there a while, one knew one's way around very well.
Was there any resistance?
We got fired on, not by anything very big. Always keeping that Admiral's admonition in mind. We didn't go after anything very big. We would, if one saw something firing at one would usually turn, I would, and dive down and fire back. But mainly it was small arms fire. We would come back with sort of 303 rounds, little small rifle rounds, wedged in corners. I had one hit the outside of my cockpit, which flung a piece. I was in the dive at the time when there was this bang on the outside, and something hit me in the neck. So I thought, oh, I'm shot. What do I do? Well, I better pull up first of all. So I pulled up, and then I thought, well, I must be bleeding, so put my hand to my neck, and was a little disappointed, really, to find that I wasn't bleeding. And then looked at the bulge of the cockpit. It had hit the outside of the cockpit, just nicked, and it's fairly thick perspex, and it had made a large sort of chunk. It had knocked out a piece of the perspex, and you know how perspex breaks. Just a small bit had come in and hit me on the neck. Disappointed slightly. There wasn't more. evidence of being wounded in battle.
There were very few anti-aircraft batteries from what you saw?
They were around the major cities. They were around Cheryong. I think it's spelled Changyong on this one. And they were certainly around Pyongyang, so we didn't go up there. There weren't any around Haiju. We were chiefly these little railway lines that are shown on this map. It was our job to keep those cut. And
you did bomb the railway.
we bombed the railway lines. It's very hard to place a bomb on a railway line, especially as it bounces when it hits the ground anyway, and you had to even... but we did. We used to cut them, and then the next day they'd be mended again. It was futile. We were...
Did you bomb bridges?
Oh yes, we bombed lots of bridges. And again, we would put a hole in the middle of the bridge, and the next day it would be patched up. So it was bridges, and they kept boats which they used to use for raiding the outer islands. The island of Chodo. This is Chodo here, though it's not marked. I think that was Chodo, and there was another island, were manned by the partisans, and I think some Americans were on them, the liaison officers. And our job was also to make sure that boats couldn't accumulate there. And
those were the people who were just guerrillas.
yes, the guerrillas would be, yes. And we bombed a cave at one time, and my second batch of 4 were the only ones that hit the cave. They went right into the cave, and apparently destroyed, we heard later, quite a few boats. So that were in there because the explosion of 4 40-pound, 80-pound, 40-pound rocket heads makes quite a explosion.
Can they be sent horizontally?
Rockets, well no, they couldn't, because the cave was not very big, probably about the height of this room. The mouth of the cave wasn't much bigger than the size of this room. And we were coming down at probably a 45-degree angle, and it was in a cliff. It was a fairly high cliff, so one couldn't... so most of our rockets either hit the water in front of it or hit the top of the cliff. But mine went in. That's because I just arrived out there and had just been on course, practicing day after day after day after day, with somebody measuring our angle of dive, etc. So that was about the only time we didn't do very much damage. We tried not to. My most memorable impression of Korea was really rather a sad one. At least I hope it wasn't sad. It seemed the Chinese used to billet their forces on the villages, and we'd be told which houses, even in a village, by the partisans, the commander was in of that local unit, and we'd go off and bomb that part of the village. But the friend that he'd been in during World War II and come back in, so he was a lot older than I and senior to me. He flew number 3 in this unit. I flew number 4, which meant I was his wingman. And we developed a system by which he would fly back off of them. If there were troops in a village, it was our job to sort of get them out or destroy them. But you couldn't really tell. You never saw anybody, usually, by day on the roads. Ox carts were out there, farmers were out there. We would attack ox carts, usually giving the farmer a burst of fire away from him to let him know that we were going to shoot up his ox cart. Would he please let the ox go? We didn't want to kill his ox. And that's a poor man's livelihood. But the carts were used for carrying. And usually the farmers would let the ox go, release the ox, dive into a ditch, and then we break up his ox cart, which, as the CEO of my squadron said, really resulted in there being a kit for making an ox cart after we'd finished. That was one farmer didn't.
Why did you destroy the ox cart?
Because they were requisitioned at night to move stores, move stuff to the front. And the idea was to have nothing on the roads that could move. But as I said, at night you could see they had lots. One farmer did not release his ox. He merely leapt off and dived into a ditch. And so as punishment, we chased the ox cart miles down the road just by firing just behind it, keeping the poor ox trotting until he also put one wheel in the ditch and got stuck. But the farmer had to walk a long way to get it.
It sounds as though you were very humane farmers. Is that
Well,
unusual, do you think?
I don't know, but I think so. That was the point I was wavering away from. This one time, what we would do to look for troops in villages is Russ Heaton, this friend of mine, and the leader of this, my leader. He would fly over the village at about 100 feet or so and fire off a burst of cannon fire, just straight out over the top. But cannon fire sounds very, very loud when you're on the ground. I spent one weekend up at the front and I heard it and was jumped about a foot in the air, and I had no idea it was so noisy. And I would be about half a mile or so behind him, down at about 30, 40 feet above the ground, down the main street. Look, these were just, these are open fields. It's sort of like Kansas, there, away from the mountains. So 40 feet was still a long way from
That's about 3 stories, isn't it? In America.
well, maybe it was less. Maybe it was just rooftop height. But then I could look into the doorways or the windows, but I'd be well behind him, so they wouldn't really hear me. They'd hear him go past. And the burst of fire, the objective of that was to see if anybody looked out after he'd gone past. And then I would come down looking in the doorways to see if there were any troops there. On this occasion, as I came down, there was a side street off. There was a young woman, almost flat on her face. She wasn't flat on her face. She'd thrown herself on the ground, holding herself up on her left hand arm, clutching a baby with her right arm, looking absolutely terrified. With an oxygen mask on, you probably look pretty frightening because the microphone's in the oxygen mask anyway. But I waved to her, hoping she didn't think it was a threatening gesture, trying to say, sorry, didn't mean to disturb you. And then called to Russ Heaton to climb and just go straight ahead, where I knew she could see us. So we both just climbed and climbed and climbed and disappeared into the wanting to indicate to her that we were not coming back. But I was probably from here to the next house from her, so you could see clearly that absolute terror in her face, clutching this baby. And I felt awful about it, terrible, which is why we went away.
If you had seen soldiers
We'd have shot them.
with machine gun fire?
Yes. And unless we did one time. We found a whole bunch of Chinese, young Chinese soldiers sitting on a beach just opposite the island of Chodo. And they weren't supposed to be there. And so I went down and I fired at them. And they were sitting there. And then I turned around to come back thinking, okay, now they're going to be firing back. So maybe this is going to be fun. and fired at them again, and a dog got up and ran, got out of the way, which I was sort of happy to see that the dog wasn't hit. And none of them fired, they just sat there. They had their rifles with them, but they didn't do anything. They were terrified. So I left them. You can't shoot at somebody who's not shooting back. No, I didn't think so. It's I don't mind shooting at anybody who shoots at me, but I'm not going to shoot at people who. These were obviously very young men. So those were the two memories I bring back of people on the other side. Otherwise, from the air, you're not involved in the war at all. It's not the same as being on the front line at all.
Did you have contact with South Koreans at all?
Yes. Not on the ship. When I visited the front line, there were, of course, I visited the Royal Australian Regiment, the 2nd Battalion, I think, for a weekend. And they had South Korean, the ROC, liaison officers with them. The one I met, I was standing in the bar, in the officers' bar, which was a little sort of wooden hut up in the front line, close to the front line. And I remember it was a good indication of the Koreans' attitudes towards the press. I was dressed in nondescript sort of army khakis because naval uniform stood out rather. Wasn't quite the camouflage stuff. Standing at the bar, and he was introduced to me, and he turned away almost immediately and started to talk to somebody else. And then, his name was Captain Kim, but they were all called Kim, it seemed to me, sort of like Smith. He turned to me, finally, and said, and which newspaper do you represent? And I said, I'm not with a newspaper. He said, oh, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm normally on a ship offshore here, and I'm just visiting. Oh, his whole attitude changed completely. Bought me a drink immediately. It was an extraordinary switch from total disdain and I don't want to talk to you. Obviously hated the press, to one of being very welcoming. And
why would they hate the press?
Probably because they thought the press was always... I don't know. I really don't know. I can't guess at that.
They thought they were getting a bad press from the Americans?
I just have no idea. No idea at all. The press didn't come out to the ships. Except occasionally. What else?
How long were you on the ship and flying?
We spent 6 months. The squadrons would go out. A ship would be there for 6 months and then be relieved by another carrier. Mainly it was HMS Ocean, HMS Glory, were the two carriers that tended to take the British. Well, I was in both because when a ship came out there, it had 2 squadrons aboard, and there were 8 pilots per squadron. For the Korean operation, they increased that to 12 pilots who could keep the aircraft running more than you could keep the pilots running. So we would be doing about 2 sorties a day, which doesn't sound very much. It isn't very much, really. Again, compared with people in the front line who are there for 24 hours a day. But they would send perhaps, the normal strength of a squadron was 8 pilots, and they would send another 4 out to bring it up to 12 halfway through the ship's tour of duty. And then when the next ship came, those 4 who'd only been there half the time would transfer to the next ship. And then there were people who knew their way around, and we would be there to say, there were gun positions there. This is Haiju, this is such and such, and be the sort of the tour guides, which I did. Apropos that, when I came out, somebody needed to tell me everything. I just thought it was the most gallant thing I've ever known anybody to do, which was the senior pilot of the squadron, who never met me. I was just out of training and had just arrived, and my first trip, my first day, my 21st birthday, I was sent off in the morning just to do deck landings.
But you had not done before.
Not on that ship. No, I'd done the dummy deck landings. I'd met up with the batsman in Japan.
But that's on land.
On land, yes. But I was fully qualified to deck land. But then, in those days, it wasn't a mirror. It was a batsman standing at the end with 2 flags, telling you what to do. And it was very much a 2-person operation. The batsman and the pilot together landed that aircraft. Oh, the batsman belongs to the aircraft carrier.
Okay.
He actually is a part of the aircraft carrier's crew. He does not come with a squadron, necessarily, although he works with the squadron before the squadron comes to the ship. And so I spent the morning just having worked with that batsman at Iwakuni. I did 2 or 3 deck landings that morning, and then went off that afternoon on my first strike, operational sortie. But this gallant senior pilot, who is the second in command of the squadron, came in the back seat with me, knowing nothing about me. But he came in the back seat and said all the time, well, this is such and such, and pointed out the scenery and where the gun positions were, and even entrusted me to land him safely back. I was most impressed. I was glad that he was decorated at the end of that, when the ship went on. Yes. He was a wonderful man.
Did you lose any of the ships, of the planes from the squadron?
Yes. Not so many. I don't think we lost any from that squadron. I was there 3 months with that squadron, and then 3 months with another squadron that we picked up in. The ships changed in Hong Kong. We went back to Hong Kong, switched ships. I moved from one to the other, and then came back out during that 2-week period that the American ship, the U.S. carrier, was on station. We lost a lot. There were 2 squadrons there, the fighter squadron and our squadron. 16 pilots altogether. 8, no, there's normally 8. 30, we had 16 pilots, I think, in each squadron, but probably 32. We lost, I think, 12 of those pilots. I shared a cabin with 2 of them, one a friend I'd known at school, at prep school, which is under 13. And the other I trained with both of them. And they were both killed on the same day. And I moved out of that cabin. I found another cabin. That was a depressing day. No, that was the stupid thing. Some of them were. One friend, Mac MacDonald, a lovely New Zealander, literally shot out of the sky. But he was going down a valley on an attack, and the fire hit him from both sides. One died through sheer stupidity. Seems a de mortuis nil nisi bonum. But his engine failed when he was coming back to the ship, and all he had to do was to land on the water beside just go straight ahead, land on the water, and we had a destroyer escort out there. And for some reason, he misjudged his height above the water as he was putting the plane into the water, and just cartwheeled over and over and over. Of the ones who were the two that were killed on the same day out of my cabin, I don't think either of those were enemy fire. We'd had one shot down that day, Pug Mather, who had bailed out. He'd been shot down once before. It's an extraordinary man who bailed out twice. Once he landed in the sea and was picked up. This time he was captured. Immediately he landed. But we didn't know that because it was a cloudy day, and so the rest of us were out there looking for him. We knew roughly where he'd gone down, and we were flying all around. And Jim Simmons did a steep turn into a cloud, and you don't do that in Korea because there's a hill inside the cloud, and there was. Years later we heard he'd been buried on that hillside.
By the Koreans?
Yes, we heard, that was 20 years later almost, I heard that. And the other one, yes, he did. He was handed back during the talks. He'd had a pretty awful time as a prisoner of war, but he is a tough individual. He used to play rugby football for the Navy. He was very fun man. He came to the United States he was on loan to a Marine squadron. He was based in Key West.
What was the relationship between the American and British people on the
It was very good. The Americans loved to come aboard our ship if they could. There was a what is called a COD, C-O-D, carrier onboard delivery, that used to bring the mail out. He used an Avenger, and he used to fly, or they used to land on about halfway through our trip and bring the mail and anything else that was needed, and then take off. And one of them came down one time and but missed a wire and went into the barrier, which meant that he couldn't fly off again. And so we had to take him back to Japan, and he was so thrilled because we always had these enormous parties. We would fly for 4 days, then there'd be a replenishment day when a replenishment ship would come alongside, and we'd be oiled and replenished with any other supplies if we needed them, maybe armament at sea. And then we'd fly for another 4 days, and then we'd go back to Japan. And so on the 4th evening and on the 8th evening, there'd be this wild party in the wardroom. The British Navy having bars in the wardrooms. And the look of amazement on the faces of these American officers. In fact, I think it was when this COD pilot was there that he was so, well, the party was getting a little noisy, and the executive officer, the commander, announced suddenly that he would sing a song. Instead of everybody else singing these rowdy, vulgar songs, he would sing a song. And he had a fine, sort of operatic baritone. and he sang the real Rule Britannia when Britain's first at Heaven's command did whatever that did. Anyway, Britannia rule the world. And when he got to the Rule Britannia bit, everybody joined in, this absolute roar. And I looked to see, there was these two American officers sitting off to one side, and the look of total amazement on their faces. They didn't know this wave of patriotism from these drunken oafs. It was, but it set the tone, and everybody then became far more dignified. So we did have a lot of parties. We had a lot of parties ashore. It wasn't good for one's liver.
Did you tell me you dressed for dinner?
Oh yes.
Now where was that, on shore?
No, on board.
And what did that mean? You wore
Bow tie and monkey jacket, little short jacket.
unbelievable. Every night?
Every night.
And then at 4 a.m. you went out and flew over the Saudi?
Yes, in a rubber immersion suit with a gun, with a 45 revolver. No, it wasn't a 45, it was a 38, strapped to one's hip. I kept mine with only 4 bullets in it because I was terrified that I'd trip the trigger by mistake. And so I even allowed for one trip, 2, I'd keep the first 2 chambers empty. And the only person who ever used one, Pug Mather, when he was shot down, had a 45 that he'd bought from an American in Japan for the price of a bottle of scotch. For a bottle of scotch. A straight swap, that was the rate of exchange then for the poor, dry American ships. And he said years later it wasn't years later, it was 2 or 3 years later that he came back, that he'd been fired upon as he was coming down, so he pulled out his 45 and was firing back at them. And then the thought occurred to him that perhaps he might stand a better chance if he didn't have an empty 45. So he threw it away when he was halfway down, regretting it later, but he wouldn't have had it anyway. But no, the revolvers weren't needed. And but yes, we always dressed for dinner in the Navy. The only reason not to is if you're night flying, and we didn't do that in that ship. In other ships, you could be in an immersion suit.
Seems like such a wonderful anachronism for the whole rest of your life there. But maybe
Apropos, the biggest anachronism I found, and I still, every Christmas, I remember the absurdity. This was Christmas Day 1952, and went to communion in the morning in a wetsuit because we were then going to fly immediately afterwards. And because it was Christmas Day, we all fired our rockets off into the air. We didn't try and hit anything. We were embarrassed to be there. We thought, what on earth are we doing out here on Christmas Day? And so Christmas communions always strike me as I always go back to that one.
So when your term of duty was over in Korea, then you came back to Britain?
I came back on a troop ship from Japan. That was an experience in itself, because it was one of the old steamers for the Far East. But this was just before, this was in 53, January, March, or April 53, the end of March 53. And all of the regiments represented in Korea, in the Far East, were sending their detachments back to take part in the coronation. And they were sending a colonel, a major, and a couple of subalterns, a captain or a lieutenant, the subalterns, back for the parade, and because they were going back, they were sending their ones who won decorations. Because the Queen would then be able to give them, they'd have an investiture when they were there. And these were really the brightest and the best of all of the regiments out there. And so we had about 10 or 12 regiments represented on that troop ship, with myself and a couple of other naval people there. At least 10 of the army officers I'd been at school with, because I went to a very army school. And so it was an incredible 30 days of doing nothing but playing bridge or poker and sitting on the deck in the sunshine as we went back home.
Now, were you being returned to be part of the coronation as well?
No. I was, except that we were, but I was going back because my tour of duty was over. I'd come out by air. They flew me out, but they sent me back by sea, which was much more fun. We were part of the coronation because there was a fly past. There was a naval review at Spithead, which is at Portsmouth, and we put every single aircraft of the Fleet Air Arm into the air. I think there were 340 aircraft. The Fleet Air Arm is not a big service, and that was quite an experience in itself. Yes, I was in part of that. Just
How old was you then?
21 still. The really tricky thing about that was we were flying very tight formation with 300 and something aircraft. You tend to run into other people's slipstream and it tends to be bumpy, but we were coming over the fleet. And that weekend it was down from the south of England, and my sister had been offered the use of a horse, but she wanted to look at it because it was said not to like people very much. And I'd gone out with her to look at it, and with a piece of rope, which is all we'd had, managed to catch it and put the rope around its head like a halter, but I had to hold it tightly, and the horse reared up on end. This has got nothing to do with the Korean War, I don't think, anyway. And the horse reared up with me holding on under its chin, which pulled my whole shoulder out of its socket. And so for this whole fly past, I was nursing I had put my elbows up onto the ledge on the aircraft, and didn't make for very easy flying. So that too was memorable. Didn't get to see the Queen. We flew right over the top of her, but couldn't see her.
Well, the rest of us all saw her on television. It was quite impressive. But you didn't do just a baby. Just I did. Was there any sort of group recognition as you came back into England? Or,
No.
So people came back one by one, or just quietly re-entered their civilian life?
Well, I didn't re-enter civilian life. I was in the Navy. I stayed in the Navy for 12 years. I stayed in the Navy until 1962, until I came over here.
So you continued to fly?
Yes.
And
But no, Britain doesn't do that really. Yes, they did after the war. There was a victory parade in London in 1945. Or was it 46 before they really got around to that? I think it must have been 46 was the victory parade. I think I got pictures of that too. But I was at school then. And the Korean War wasn't considered to be a war that anyone would really notice. It was a long way from home.
you were flying as part of the United Nations Force?
Yes. We wore the black and white United Nations markings on our wings. I don't know if that was to make us an easier target or stop our own people shooting us down.
Why did you made the Navy a career, it sounds like. And why did you move?
Well, half of I'd signed on for more time than I'd originally joined for national service, and as I said, I was going to the Veterinary College in London. And I had to sign on for another 2 years to go to Korea. So that kept me for 4 years. And by the time I'd been for 4 years, I was really beginning to enjoy myself enormously. And stayed for another 4, and then, actually I stayed for another 8. I signed on for a full 12 years. By the time the 12 years was up, I'd been posted over here on loan to the Canadian Navy, which I said yes I'd do. The Navy being small enough, there were 360 pilots, one officer in the Admiralty, in charge of sending them everywhere. You invariably, by the time you'd been in the Navy for a few years, you knew him. It's so small, and he would always call you up and say, well, I got this job, which would you like? And I jumped at the Canadian one because I knew somebody over here who I married, who lived in Sudbury.
That's a very good reason.
I'd met her in England.
Married her?
No, I'd met her in 1949. I knew her brothers very well because they lived in England. But that is really what brought me to America. I brought her back there. She hated it there. And the children were getting old enough to go to school. And so I left the Navy. The British system does not work the way the American system. The American system works beautifully because you all know which grade you're in. You're in either first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade when you're tiny. And in England, you might be the bottom, the lowest form might be Form 4 or it might be Form 1. You have no idea. And when you move a child from one school to another, it's a totally different system. And so neither my then wife nor I wanted our children to be transferred. Also, she wanted to come back here. So we came here in 1962.
And here you still are?
Here I still are.
If you look back on it now, what would you say the impact of your military experience has been on your life as a whole?
Probably.
It's a very big question.
Yes, probably enormous. Had I come out of the Navy after my draft period, after 2 years, I might be a country vet somewhere wrestling with a Pekingese every other day. Except I wanted to be a large animal vet, not a small animal vet. I think it made a major change, and I wouldn't swap the changes for anything. So I wouldn't want to be anywhere but where I am now, married to who I am now.
So it was really, in almost all respects, a positive experience for you.
My service in the Navy was a positive experience. Oh yes, it was enormous fun. My closest friends in England, naturally, because I really wasn't there, are still old naval friends. We always stay with one in London who retired a few years ago as a Commodore. And another one came and saw us here. He'd been my student. I'd taught him to fly helicopters. And he was over here as a commander at Norfolk. And he came up to Maine with us to stay at the Wilbur's cottage. We rented that.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to say in conclusion? Have we pretty much covered the field?
I think we have. I think, in retrospect, I'm sure the British forces were useful in Korea, but my Korean experience, I'm not certain that I made the slightest difference.
Well, you saved the woman with the baby, that's for sure.
We didn't save her. I hope. I'm afraid. No, not even that. We weren't shooting at the ground. You know, we were shooting over the tops, just trying to get people out. And I thought, as I waved to her with an oxygen mask on, I thought, you must be the most terrifying sight in the world. And do you know the story of it's the appointment in Samara. The story where where the man sends his servant into town. A man sent his servant into town and to do an errand for him, and the servant came back. This was somewhere in Morocco, and the servant came back absolutely terrified. And the man said, "What's the matter? Why are you so frightened?" He said, "I saw death in the marketplace, and he threatened me. He made a threatening gesture to me." And the man said, "Well, we can make sure that he doesn't find you. He's coming for you. And so I tell you what, go immediately to my brother in Samara. Go now, quickly. Escape, because death only comes at night. And if you go to Samara, he won't find you." And so the servant set off hurriedly to Samara. And the man thought, "I'm going to look for him. Why did death do this?" So he rode into the town himself. And sure enough, there was death in the marketplace. And he said to death, went up to death and said, "Why did you threaten my servant this morning?" And death said, "I didn't threaten anyone." He said, "My servant saw you here, and he said you made a threatening gesture." "Oh, him, yes. That wasn't a threatening gesture. I started in surprise because I have an appointment. I didn't expect to see him here because I have an appointment with him tonight in Samara."
Oh.
And it occurred to me that I must have looked like death making this supposed to be a wave was a threatening gesture. I hoped it wasn't. But
well, thank you so much for a very interesting